My name's Andrew Campbell. I'm from the Game Rangers Association of Africa. I've got it at 10:45, so I think we should start. We've just got an hour for this session, so we're going to try and move through. There's quite a lot to cover, but we're just going to move through the very basics of it and then allow a lot of time for discussion. So just firstly, thanks for coming down. Best practice approaches to ranger training, right? Just to give you a bit of background, Game Rangers Association of Africa, for those that are unfamiliar with it, established in 1970. We now have just over 2,500 members based across 25 countries, and we're a group of rangers supporting rangers. We work as the International Ranger Federation regional body in Africa, and across three different spheres. One is ranger advocacy work, one is creating ranger networks, and the other is direct support projects for rangers. That's just some of the spread of where our members work and live. You'll see the North Africa definitely an area we need to do more work in. So I'm just going to take you through some of the sort of background to this. Essentially, what we're going to be talking about today is some kind of best practice guideline around approaches to ranger training. We're not dealing with curriculums or competency frameworks or anything like that. So it's just around how do we approach ranger training. And these are some of the questions and that we've had over the last few years, or the last sort of 12 or 13 years that I've been involved. Continual questions from people like our panelists here who work in the ranger training, and I'll introduce them a bit later, but who work in the ranger training world around a lot of ranger training being unregulated and in some cases illegal in the country that it's taking place. Ranger training being not sustained, so many people approaching it and funders approaching it with a drop-in, drop-out kind of training. So we arrive, we train rangers for 3 days, and you never see us again. Training in a vacuum, so that's about not approaching it from a holistic point of view. So sending one ranger off to a facility, sometimes in a different country, and them going and getting some training there, and then coming back into a system where what they learnt is actually not hasn't been bought into by the management team. So training in a vacuum, and it happens a lot. And then a need for consistency in terms of a sustained effort of training. We know it's not a once-off thing. We know that there are rangers out there where the last training they did, they've been in the industry 30 years. They went through a basic field ranger training course 30 years ago. That's it. So we need consistent approach and a holistic approach to it. And then professionalism. And this comes out of the World Ranger Congress in 2019. A couple of you were there, I think. Around a drive to professionalize the ranger industry, right? So these kind of guidelines, I think, fit into that. So the principal goal is to obviously try and raise the standard of training, and it's not just about improving training standards, but we're doing that to improve or to reduce the risks to rangers themselves, and to improve conservation outcomes in these areas that they work. The intention is just guidance and recommendations, and to try and reach and document consensus. What we found is there was consensus out there when we spoke to our members and like the gentleman here on my left that worked in the ranger training space, but consensus hadn't really been documented in this really basic form. So and this is very much a foundational sort of guideline of recommendations. And the aim, obviously, to promote all those things that we said we don't want in the industry. So to promote a professional, sustainable, holistic, and consistent approach to ranger training. The target audience here would be professional ranger training providers, and we know we have NGOs working in the space. We have for-profit and non-profit entities, and most importantly, I think we have state institutions which are responsible for training, doing in-house training across Africa. And without buy-in from them, I think we really. I'm just trying to find the right words here. But we're really going to battle, unless we get buy-in from the national state management authorities. So ranger employers, and of course, there we have state conservation management authorities, NGOs and community-based organizations we know we have volunteer rangers working out there today, and I think something that's often not considered is there are rangers out there doing rangers work for no pay and not due any pay. It's not because they're not getting paid; they're doing it on a voluntary basis. We know in the marine sector a lot of voluntary rangers. Ranger representatives, so RF, GRA, and the national associations. We have a few national associations in Africa, not many. It's something we're trying to develop. And then obviously donors and funders of training. And that's where we really need buy-in. So I don't know how many of you guys, maybe if I run through these, how many of you are in the training provider sort of sector? I know Boris, James, a couple of others. Ranger employers, how many of you guys employ rangers? I'm just making sure we're speaking to the right people here. Do you have anyone from the RF and the GRA? Okay. And any donors and funders in here? Okay, so we've actually got someone representing each of these sectors, which I think is really important, because this isn't something that we want for ourselves. This is something we need to talk to all of you guys about and get your buy-in and your inputs on this. So in terms of the contribution to this, those that have contributed are Game Rangers Association of African members, many of them with lots of experience in the industry, right? And experience is gained through actual training. We have people like, a lot of them couldn't be here today, and James Stiles here works with conservation outcomes. They've been in this space through Brian Harris and them for 30 plus years in the sector. Duncan is working up in conservation laws in Zambezi, and working with Mike Hensman, who obviously couldn't be here as well. But we also, we're taking experiences of the guys that we're working with on the ground, and certainly my experience in this field is gained from all of you guys, rather than I'm not a ranger trainer myself, but from talking to people like Ruben de Kock, who works with Boris, and Brian and James and these gents here. Greg, obviously, from Chengeta Wildlife. So pulling information from the teams that we all work with and then trying to put it into some kind of format that we then will take out to the industry for comment. And elected ranger representatives. So from a GRA point of view, we put this in front of guys that have been elected by their colleagues to serve as representatives for the industry. And that includes people like Benson Kanyembu at Conservation South Luanga. Some of you guys might be familiar with Benson. One, Benoit from up in Cote d'Ivoire, he works with the national authority there, and he's the RF Africa representative, and various other people. Eric Madamalala, who has a rich history in conservation, Nick Funda from Sandparks and from GRA Exco, Chris Galliers himself from RF. So there's a lot of thoughts gone into this, and hopefully it provides value. So this is basically the framework of when we started pulling together all these recommendations that were lying either in other documents or in what we had discussed around the fire, what we thought would be good recommendations for the industry, was basically putting things together. And this may change, but this is where the guidelines are sitting at the moment. And we've got sort of 1 or 2 line guidelines in each. The numbers there on the right show how many. So general principles of training, we've got 11 key points we think are pertinent there, and so forth. We've tried to keep it as basic as possible. And those that have been in this space, please don't expect this to be any high-level stuff. This is really basic-level stuff around ranger training. I'm not going to run through all those now. We're going to run through those in a little bit of detail. But the idea was to basically apply the sort of adaptive management framework to ranger training. And any decent trainers are using this model anyway, which is about, first of all, assessing what's happening on the ground, what the needs of the park are, what the needs of the rangers are, what the threats are at the park, actually coming up with a plan. We know a lot of training takes place without assessments or plans having taken place. And everyone wants to jump in at step 3, which is implementation. And then no one wants to actually review, has it been successful? What lessons have we learned? Is the capability that we've tried to improve actually there? And do we need to adapt how we're doing things? And do we need to come back and refresh our trainings? And so basically applying this sort of holistic approach to it. And here I just wanted to touch on this, which is what we call the 7 pillars of an effective ranger team. And you'll see training sits as one of those, but everything is based on integrity and leadership. And we'll touch on that a bit later. because we can train until we're blue in the face. If we don't have integrity and leadership at site level, we're wasting our time and our money. All right, so I'm going to now I've sort of introduced the panel. I don't know if you guys want to introduce yourselves a bit, or maybe when you have your first comment, just say a little bit about your background and where you're from. But I'm just going to run through that framework now. We're going to run through quite quickly, as I say, to be able to have a discussion afterwards. But in terms of general principles, so here we're looking at things like, recommendations around training should be legal, it should be ethical, it should be tailored to the situation and to the needs of the rangers. It should be sustained, consistent, holistic, and professional. And that's basically what this whole document is about. And it's not a long document, but it's about trying to get those key principles in place. And I think they all look really simple, right? And they are really simple. But often this is where things are falling down, is at this simple level here. I don't know if you guys, maybe we'll move into each of the areas, and then you can provide some comment. The first one is around some kind of strategic needs assessment, and this sometimes has different names. But for this document's purposes, we said strategic needs assessment should be conducted. I don't know who wants to sort of kick off with that and why it's important, and maybe how you guys do it in practice. Someone's just going to Lou upstairs. I hope that's not a sign of what you're talking about.
Hi there, good morning. My name is James Stiles. I work for Conservation Outcomes. Been there just under 10 years. And the strategic needs assessment is basically the start that we feel is an important start in any training implementation. So getting a needs assessment in place before we start training is of utmost importance, because if you come in there and in the implementation stage, we often find that a lot of money is squandered in well-intended money is squandered. Where if it's done holistically, and we start with a strategic needs assessment and we move through selection, training, and then into the advanced training, then that's exactly where we need to move. We find that when we arrive at places in Africa or protected areas in Africa, these basic steps aren't in place. And when we get there, we notice that a lot of the training that's been done in the past is in-out training, and we like to try and implement this holistic approach. So that's where we like to go with this.
Sure, thanks, James. And I think key there is who's going to do the strategic needs assessment as well, and getting qualified people that understand the threats and risks at park level to undertake that. And that's done in conjunction with the management team, right? It's not something where you arrive, you disappear, and you hand back a report 2 months later. It's really sitting with them and having the local input into what the needs are there. And obviously out of that comes the training needs analysis, which is part of that. Then we looked at just having some kind of training plan, and I think the first point there is it's got to be aligned and integrated with the management plan of the park, right? So if with the local context of what's ethical and legal at park level, it needs to include obviously things like initial training that must be undertaken, and then what the sort of schedule around refresher and in-service and mentoring requirements are to embed those skills, right? Duncan, I don't know if you want to share just some of your thoughts there.
Hi, I'm Duncan Bam. I lead a small training and security advisory group called Resolve. And unlike the medalla on the left, we sort of new entry into the sector, although a number of our consultants and trainers have been doing this for a good period. What I first want to say is, coming into the sector, it was very interesting, sort of doing that study about, what the need is, what the service is that's out there already, and what the regulation was. And I actually found it quite striking that as a new entry group, we could relatively easily just come into the sector without really being checked, for credentials or credibility or legality and also understanding. So I just sort of use that as a frame of reference, because part of what we've been trying to achieve is to see where there is good practice and try and mirror that good practice, and then find the sort of gap in that in the sort of training zone. I mean, there's significant experience out there doing good stuff. When we looked at then the strategic needs reviews and then going from that and setting up training plans, the one thing that we sort of came in to see was the need for a realistic training plan based on the context, the funding, and also the realities, the political realities that sort of sit around many parks that I think everybody would understand. In those training plans, we sort of see training as the engine for change, but it's absolutely not the output. We see it as the integrator. It brings in the technology, it brings in the skills, it brings in the management plan, and it acts as that catalyst to deliver the output. And ultimately, the training plan feeding back into an effective MEL framework allows for you to then really test and validate what that activity is delivering, at the far end. And for us, that was, a really sort of important part in coming into this. Yeah.
Thanks, Duncan. This one's fairly simple. I don't think we'll delve into this, but just the development of materials. So obviously, adapting materials that you might have that might be, useful in other areas to what's happening locally. So, bearing in mind the legal frameworks can be different in different countries, different customs, and that's something that's often overlooked in this, is the different customs with the different ethnic groups that form part of that ranger force. Language. We were having the chat just before this about how Francophone Africa is often left out of these conversations, just based merely on language. So, how do we adapt, and how do we make sure that we're adapting things to the different languages and local situations? So here we looked at, sort of training providers and instructors. And this, I think in this part, it's about, talking to things like, the training providers should embrace the RF Code of Conduct for Rangers. If you're going to train rangers, you should be comfortable with adopting the code of conduct that rangers have to sign up for. Things like vetting, and I think Duncan's touched on that, is actually vetting of rangers, of ranger trainers, often not happening at site level. We know that many protected areas are desperate for help, and will take any help that's offered. And we end up with undesirable trainers sometimes arriving to do training that they're not qualified to do, or that is not suitable to the context that those rangers are working in. Greg, I don't know if you want to touch on this. We talk about mandates and permissions and experience, and just some overall thoughts on this aspect.
No. I kind of sort of, my approach to it when you're looking at sort of instructors and training is recognition that in the far distance, what you want to get to is this point of autonomy. You want the park to be able to self-operate. You want the park to be able to look after itself and generate its own training, to generate and maintain its own standards. And it's when you look at these and you're coming up with these sort of training plans and strategies, is this idea that you're building in the development of their own trainers from the outset. And it sort of touches on this idea of leadership. But could I just get a sense in the crowd? How many here are manage operational field teams? When you pass down your orders, or you're asking for certain tasks to be done, are you talking to everyone, or are you talking to certain people?
No, regional leaders or section leaders, because all the guys are very hard to push. They have to follow that chain of command.
So this is exactly where I think that if we're going to start looking at the next step, beyond the fantastic stuff that's been done, is this idea of developing leadership. Hey, your leaders, how many are they in charge of?
4 8-man teams.
4 to 8 man teams. So can you see if you train up one person, it has a disproportionate effect or a disproportionate return. You train up a leader, it's going to impact on 8 people in that team. And so that your training audience that you're trying to look at is much smaller. Could I just pose one other thing back? Do you also rely on that leader to do certain functions to make sure that the park's working?
Yeah, within reason is going to that duties, yeah.
100%. So there's this idea that I think one of the things that we're starting to focus on, if you want to have a dramatic impact and a dramatic change on parks, particularly with looking after everything from ranger welfare to making sure that the ranger teams that are going out and ground are doing what they've got to do, start focusing on the development of leadership. Start looking at those people that have done a fantastic job in the parks where you give him a chance for promotion, a chance to go to a next level up where he's incentivized. And I think that that's incredibly important. Leadership is an area that we're focusing on. I'm happy to talk about. Thanks, mate.
No, thanks, Greg. And I think we're going to chat. You'll see leadership and is going to come up again and again here. Just 2 points there around, and I think Greg's talking to that there, is around on-site capacity building. So not creating a dependency on the training provider, right? Because I think that often happens. You know, training provider creates a dependency, and forevermore they need to come back and train and train and train and train. So what kind of, what skills are we leaving behind? Are we involving, senior rangers in the training? Are we getting them to train alongside? They might have no training experience themselves. They might have never been through the course that you're presenting themselves, but now they've got to lead a team that's going to go through the course. So that on-site involvement, really crucial. And then the SLA, so service level agreement between the trainer and the training provider. How many of you guys have had training where you don't have an SLA in place to protect you and to protect the trainer? Yeah? And what does the trainer want in there in terms of getting out of a contract, and what do you want in there to get you out of a training contract that you might have signed up to? And very basic level stuff. It's not, you could probably write a whole paper on what should be in the SLA, but just very basic level stuff around what trainers and parks should look for in there. This is another one I think I'm going to skip through just from a time point of view, but when you're implementing the training, so, training taking place on site or in realistic training environments, and then the logistical support and facilities provided to the trainer. Those that have been in the training game will know you'll sometimes arrive at a park, and if the logistics aren't there or in place, you might as well turn around and go home. There's no food, there's no place to stay, there's no wash facilities for the teams. Getting that, what are the obligations there on the park in terms of having logistical support for you while the training's being undertaken? A hugely important part of training, obviously, selection. And as I say, guys, this is not rocket science. This isn't new stuff that we're presenting here. This is very old principles, tried and tested principles, but around selection. So, and adapting the selection to what the sort of person that we're trying to get out of the training at the end, because the context of that matters. If we're training rangers for Table Mountain National Park, which we can see from here, or for Virunga, we might run a slightly different selection program. So setting standards and getting buy-in from protected area management on those standards. They actually need to set those standards. Vetting, and pre-screening of prior to selection, and ownership of the selection process. And that's about that lies at site level. We know a lot of recruitment and happens at regional office level, and we've spoken with many parks like that, where HR in I'll be careful to name which town, but HR in the main city will send you 10 new rangers that they've selected through an application process and of looking at a few CVs. And you've now got to then train these guys. You've had no involvement in terms of selection. So the selection really needs to sit at site level, quality control during that selection process. And then, ultimately, sometimes in-service rangers also need to go through that selection. And how do we go about that? It's tricky. I'm sure there's guys that have done that and sat down with park managers and said, we now need to take the guy that's been in the field for 10 years and put him through a selection process. A difficult one to get across the line. In terms of training courses, and we didn't want to go into massive depth here because, as I said, this is not a curriculum, but was about that if you really distill it down to the basics, there's probably 3 courses And that's a basic course, a specialized course, and a senior or leadership course. And this is aligned with the Global Ranger Competency Standards, which URSA, the Universal Ranger Support Alliance, and the International Ranger Federation have developed a very simple competency framework, and just saying these are the kind of things we should be looking at any site. There should be a basic training course that everyone needs to go through. Then if you've got specialized units, whether it's specialized intelligence units or specialized anti-poaching units, they would then need some specialized training for those skills over and above what the standard field ranger would go through. And then obviously if people are going to be promoted into leadership positions, you need to invest in that. Often we see leaders promoted because of time in the saddle or ability to communicate in the chosen language of the site or various other reasons. But are we actually investing in those people? And I think here maybe to just back to Greg's point around the leadership training, that you're really when we look at the metrics of where the money towards training goes, a lot of that flows to basic training, right? And we end up with sausage machines of producing hundreds of new rangers into the sector, and very little at that senior, what we'd call a senior or a leadership training level. And how do we redirect that? Because I think, that's sometimes it's about what metrics we want in the annual report. We want to say we trained 100 rangers, whereas actually that money would be better spent on training 3 in a sustained fashion over 3 years. And that's sometimes a difficult concept to get to the accountants or the people in the public relations of our NGO. So about investing at the right level here. Duncan, I don't know if you want to touch on this. I know this was something that you brought into these guidelines, but around systems level training and validation.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think just sort of building on that point about leadership is, with leadership, one can look at, who you're recruiting, how you're recruiting them, but also what is the system that they're operating in, and is that system being developed in parallel to the individual leadership, and then also, the ranger training at grassroots level. I think it would be fair to say that 90% of the training is focused at rangers because the metrics are appealing. But if you use the case study that was presented yesterday during the preventative deaths scenario, if you just go and train the ranger at the far end and think that that's going to save lives, you're probably wrong. And I think everyone would agree with that. So what does one need to do beyond just training the rangers? Obviously then train the operational systems, the operational level, and then to make sure that the policy guidance and everything sort of flows into that. So when we talk about systems level training, it's about bringing the force multipliers in and making sure that those force multipliers, like EarthRanger, like SMART, like all of these systems that are there, are actually then translated into capability. And that they don't just sit there as an unutilized tool to make sure that you can have that most effective pathway in the example of a casualty evacuation, what have you. And then I think it also lends to this point about individual versus collective training, where a lot of the training we tend to do is on the individual skill. It could be fitness, it could be first aid, it could be comms, and then that individual within a team. But how often do we train the team within an operational context, and then the operational context within a landscape context? And actually doing scenario testing to run that whole cycle to really identify where your strong and your weak points are, understand that need, and then reinvest from that point forward.
Yeah, and very basically, I think one of the easiest examples that we can grasp in this is with canine training, right? So we send the dog handler off to Paramount, a security company that runs, I'm not picking on them, but we send, this is just a recent example, we send one guy off to go and do his canine training, who then comes back with a fresh new dog and some fresh new skills. But the team that he has to do follow-ups with have no idea how to use him and his dog, most effectively, right? Or how to walk with them in the veld, or how to follow a track, and how to not disturb the track. Very basic stuff. But that follow-up unit needs to be trained together, right? And And the other rangers in that four-man team need to understand the capability of the handler and the dog. Very, very basic level stuff. But often we're seeing, we're paying in rands terms, 30, 40, 50,000 rand to train the single canine handler, and now we think we've got canine capability and we don't. And we wonder why, when their follow-up happens, that we end up messing it up as the other rangers in that team, because we've never worked with the dog, or we're scared of the dog. We don't want to come near it. So a very sort of basic level around that. And then the last point, just around the sort of monitoring and evaluation, reporting and follow-up. One thing there, formal recognition to learners. We all love a good shiny certificate at the end of training, but what is the proof that these guys have actually been through something? And that's really important at an individual ranger level. If I move on, where's the proof that I actually got trained in something by somebody credible and now actually have this competency in this area, whatever it is. We touched on it earlier, but the metrics used, in terms of monitoring and that we really should be looking at evaluating the effectiveness of the training is actually, have we made a difference? When we drafted the training plan, we said we want to improve whatever it is, let's keep with the canine theme, but we want to improve the canine capability of the team. Let's unpack what the indicators are of that and how do we monitor and evaluate that. I don't know if any of you guys want to touch on this really important part of it.
I mean, I could jump in on the evaluation point, but I want to do what you did, which is link to some of the other fantastic briefs we've got. If you've got this idea of a system where the park is continuing to learn, continuing to evaluate just how they're doing things, and you recognise that skill sets of rangers is perishable, that over time, what you learnt 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you can't retain. Skill fade, exactly. And so what you need to do is you need to have this point in the life cycle of the park where you're able to bring in the team to train them back up. If I'm talking about medical training and linking it again to that preventable deaths, refresher training is actually about, this is your chance to educate everyone. This is what we've learnt this year. This is what we've got to do. These are the changes that we've got to implement to get you back up to these skill levels. Medical training is always changing. Here is a juncture where you can refresh on that. The other one that I think is critically important when it comes to refresher training is everything to do with the legal process. If success is a judicial outcome, then you need to make sure that every single ranger is acting within the parameters of rule of law, that the evidence collection is tip-top so that you get the judicial outcome. Now, you cannot tell me if a ranger got that training 10 years ago, he still knows what's going on. And this is his point. If you recognise that what they have got, the skill set that they've got is perishable, then you need to do that refresher training. And the evaluation point will tell you which ones you need to prioritise on.
Right, so we're about half an hour in, so about halfway. I think time-wise we're doing well. And then obviously, so those are the different sort of chapters, should I say, of things. We might try and condense those down a bit because we want to make this as simple as possible. But those are sort of some of the key points. And as I say, under each of those, we've got sort of key points there. So something like, refresher training and the need to specify how that works. Is it going to happen in-house? When does your external training provider come back and do a formal refresher on these? Because some of the skills, you need to do that. Sometimes legally, like in South Africa with firearms training, you need to do various things during the year to demonstrate that capability and to keep that accreditation or that certification in place. Just looking at sort of next steps from here in terms of this document, it's not out in the public sphere as yet. Sort of explained how it was developed and then the need for it. But now we move into a case, and this is the first time we sort of chatted about it. I thought it was a great forum to pull on your guys' experience, but as continued validation of this. So here's an invitation for those that want to have a look at it. We're going to be distributing this. Once I do a bit of editing down there's a little bit of repetition here and there, we'll distribute this probably by in the next 2 weeks or so. to our membership group, so it'll pass by them. And if you're not a member of ours, you're more than welcome to to contribute and to have a look and see. It's as I say, it's not. I don't think it's a threatening piece of work. It's very low level. It's very old. What's the word for it? Tried and tested principles in this space. And now it's what this is about consolidating and getting that consensus actually documented. So sensitization of that, and that's with those different stakeholders that we spoke about. So talking to the other ranger trainers, talking to the protected area management authorities, whether they be state or NGOs that are working in that space, and then talking to the money as well, of saying if you're going to spend money on training, we think as the industry that this is the most effective way to do it, and just follow some of these basic principles, understanding that those that are writing grants do not come from this industry. They don't come from experience in this. And I think if we can get some buy-in from the money, we're halfway there. And then we've touched on it up till now, but really that leadership development, because if we're deploying rangers back into teams where there isn't sufficient and competent leadership in place, then we're all wasting our time. So really focusing as an industry on a next step about saying, okay, this is about an approach to training, and if we all follow this, we think, and a lot of people are following this without there being a guideline, but it's about saying, okay, we agree that we think this is the best approach for training. One of the next steps in that is, how do we tackle this leadership development training? And we battling with that at the moment. How do we do that? We've had multiple proposals in, and coming back to the metrics, we were told with one of those proposals, you're not putting enough guys through the system. You only want to train 20 leaders over 3 years. We want 200, and you're like, we can't do that right now. So how do we deal with that? And that's an open-ended question to the donors, to the protected area managers, to the trainers, sitting here and out there, of how we develop this, because it's not a one-stop solution in my mind. Not one of us is going to fix that problem at the bottom. And it's a really difficult one to grapple with. We've got just short of half an hour of sort of discussion time, or questions. And feel free, if you don't have a question and you just want to make a point. It's not one of those where it has to be a question. If you feel like there's something that you'd like to contribute, feel free. If you want to put any of them on the spot, please do. I'll refer to them. I don't know if there's any hands. Let's get the other mic here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question about leadership. I think everyone's want to get to leadership, and I think it's easier when you do it with new recruits, because you start from scratch and you build it on. But in many protected areas where we work, we have, the officers, which are the models and the leaders, are already older. They have been maybe forgotten for 10, 15 years within the institution. And they are the ones that should be, leading the leadership and being the model. But they are also the ones that are the most, probably not wanting to change the system and not, wanting to go into this path. So my question is, how do we deal with this kind of different rangers? And do we have specific trainings that are targeting, this kind of people? And are we able to change, the mentality of people that have been, abandoned and have been maybe also involved in illegal things and blah, blah, blah. So that's my question.
Thank you very much for that, great question. I think the first thing, I think everyone in this room would recognise, if you're trying to start affecting change, it's not going to happen overnight. We're in agreement with that. So I think what you've got to come in this is with just a little bit of sophistication in terms of you've got to try to educate and plan the sort of transition process that takes you from the position you're in now to getting to this better place. I would always prioritise investing in the future. So if you want a better leadership program, you actually concentrate on the the rangers that are coming through, knowing that in 5-10 years' time you're going to have the right outset, and you manage the interim period in between. You asked a specific question on what are the components that are going to be on there. I'm a big believer in going for simplicity. It's simply be, know, do. Know is the skill set and the knowledge that they must have. If you're going to have, if I concentrate on a very simple system, I would say a ranger team going out on the ground, he needs to know every aspect of what the rangers do, because the rangers need to be able to follow him. They will follow someone they respect easily. So that's the knowledge component. The do part is about park machinery. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is workforce orientation and getting them to achieve what the park wants to achieve. The park operates in a certain manner. So the do is teaching them, right, if you're going out on a patrol, you've got to follow the following steps. You've got to contribute to the following, you've got to report to the chief analyst, you've got to then report to the logistics officer to get all that sort of stuff. So that's the machinery side of things. And then the final one is a little bit more esoteric, where it's about the be. What is a good leader? Now, I think everyone in this room will be in agreement with me. You show me, rangers don't work on their own, they work as part of teams. You show me a good team, I'll show you a good leader. You show me a bad team, I'll show you a bad leader. It's as simple as that. And a couple of things on the B, which I think is really important, because this is about shaping the behaviours of people that are going to be in responsible positions in the future, is getting them to be the best that they can be. So a classic one would
highlight any successful examples of where continued validation has improved a ranger force from maybe rangers who are not very well disciplined, or they had lapses in their accountability, and how continued validation has helped them improve.
Okay, thanks for that. Just to add to that last comment there, is it on? We get to areas and we often find that the leadership in the scout force has it's mismanaged. They're unfit, and but their integrity is still great. You can work with those guys. You've got to put a plan in to get their physical fitness up to shape, so that they can start leading by example again. So that it's all possible, but you've got to do it the right way. And then continued validation. I think that you've got to refresh your training and keep showing the rangers that you care about them, and that it's a continual thing. It's like doing the basics right, but just repeating it well. So that's where that continued validation comes in. We've got many examples of
to get people into different roles in the communities. And those that show the potential to become leaders and go further into the organization, there's a plan for that. They're going to be picked up, for instance, with a junior leadership course. They're going to do their years as a junior leader, then go into senior roles. So it really starts at HR level. And Ruben was always the one that said it, you got to engage human resources first, because that's where, you know, a lot of that training starts and sort of progresses. Yeah.
Thanks. It's just to make a comment as well. You know, from a sector perspective, how much should we be working towards sort of changing the narrative at the policy level away from training and the use of that sort of term, more towards, you know, establishing or advancing competence? Because I think training for so many people denotes that sort of once-off, tick the box, let's get it done, whereas everybody knows, or should know, that, you know, training does not denote competence, much like we've seen here today. So I think there is an opportunity for us as that sector to try and move people away from that idea of like, oh, we need ranger training. No, we need ranger competence. Training is a part of that. And, you know, there's ways to evaluate and monitor, but getting, kind of like what Andrew was saying, the donors and things like that to move away from that line of thought, so that the funding that you're requesting for your ranger operations, they're not looking at how many people are trained, putting 200 people through the training course. They're looking at how many people can be measured as competent going forward. And there is scope. I mean, it's not easy work, it's not fun work working at the policy level, but the more pressure we can put on those funders in terms of working towards ranger professionalization, I think, you know, gives us that better platform for the future. And I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on you know, how we can start tackling that.
James, if I can sort of follow on from that, one sort of reinforcing point is to say, when we talk about training, it's quite unhelpful, I think, on a number of levels, and one of which is immediately in people's mind, they think about an NCO doing really good firearms training, doing really good first aid training, what have you. But that is not part of the terminology that people would link to transformational programs. And I think we're actually talking about transformation of park capability. And to get into a place where, you know, language like instructors, you know, it's such a broad term, but what do we actually mean by that? Because some instructors are actually advising on policy level guidance. You know, one of our consultants is an economic modeler for the IMF. It's quite unfair to label her, you know, as an instructor within a training organization, if that makes sense. And yet she's got a direct output linked to the transformation point that you're making to develop those indicators that need to be seen to see the effectiveness of all the money, all the time, and all the energy. Yeah.
So I agree with the lack of leadership. And I'm not talking about Africa, I'm talking about in general in anti-poaching. So we lack junior leaders. We have a great training program where we train game scouts, and we're sitting with 60, 70 game scouts. And so the first thing I think you need to do is you need to have a decent selection program for your junior leaders. They must be selected in that you get the right persons. Firstly, secondly, the challenges are when you've got small teams of anti-poaching, various reserves with maybe they might have 20 game scouts. Is you need to be able to pool those junior leaders in a course, somewhere where it's realistic. So that, and you must understand that you must fail them if they want to fail. If they need to fail, they need to fail. You need to wash them out of the system, because you don't want poor leaders. Poor leaders lead to poor performance. So the challenge here is, you know, it's fine if you've got 200 game scouts and you can run a junior leader program within that. And you need to have the length of training. You need to have enough time in the training. You can't do this in 2 weeks. And you need to follow up on it. I agree with you there. So for me, a junior leader course should take at least 50 days minimum. And in that 50 days, you put them under test and you fail, who's going to fail? So you end up with a quality leader that you're going to put back in that reserve. And that person then you build on him so that eventually he could become the warden at some point. And I think that's the first thing. And the other thing is you need to build esprit de corps within that group of leaders. So that, you know, you must suffer to get there. And if you get there and you make it, then you're a good leader, and then you can build on that person. You create a glass which you can fill. Thanks.
No, thanks for that. I agree fully. One other thing I'd just like to mention there is that the leadership has to come out of the group. It's got to come from within the group. And you've got to pick your leaders out of there that have come through the ranks to be able to, to get that leadership, that esprit de corps, and also that conservation ethic build up. So absolutely, everything you said there, I absolutely confirm and agree. Selection, absolutely imperative. Don't try and take leaders from outside of the group or outside in another department and put them in just because they got a degree or something like that. They've got to be guys coming through the ranks. Thanks.
And yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think, when we talk about then, I said leadership development, right? So how are we going to develop these leaders? And that's a long-term program of work, which I don't think we've got right up till now. There are various, there are courses out there. I don't think leadership's a course, It's a program. It's a long-term thing. We're not going to just put people through a 2-week course and now they're leaders, There's the hard skills, what I'd call like the management skills required to manage a team that you guys will know. And then there's the softer leadership skills as well that need to be sort of embedded over time. And this narrative of we can't create leaders. If you look at the academic
teams, intelligence units. So basically we'll do like an in-house selection amongst the whole core sort of scout unit. And it's only the hard workers, regardless of age, they get through the selection, get through the training, and then they get incentivized by, extra salary, more training, etc. So that's worked well for us in quite a large, scout unit, but also budget dependent, obviously.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the things we ask at a site level, we've been involved with like an assessment of 35 different protected areas. One of the things is we ask, very basically, is there a selection process for people to move, up the career path? And mostly there isn't, right? There's no formalized selection criteria. They might have the number of push-ups you can do as a basic field ranger, but they won't have what's required to get to the next level, to be a corporal or a sergeant. And it's on a feel, right? This guy's ready for the step. But how have you invested in that person to get them to that point? And what are you prepared to do, continually to move them from that corporal level up to the sergeant level? Yeah, and I think that's where, and Boris, you made the point of talking to HR, but there's a lot of HR principles here, in terms of investing in people and bringing them down that career path. It's not just, I think many parks and management authorities, it's just setting them on that path, right? Putting them through a basic field ranger course, and it's off you go for the next 20 years. Yeah? And we'll see it the other side. In any profession, if we really want to professionalize the industry, in any profession, that's not acceptable. Yeah? You look, and we've spoken about it with some of the guys that have, and I know a lot of you guys will have, military experience, for example. You take someone that starts off in the military and a conservationist that starts off as a foot soldier. So as a field ranger versus, someone who's in the rifles or something to start off. And you take them over a 20-year process and look at what's been invested in each person. It'll be night and day, right? And probably zero versus a lot. And we know that resources are scarce, but that's why it's even more important to be efficient with our resources here. Yeah? I do believe that the money is actually there. We've got enough in the system, but we're not spending it, and we're wasting a lot of it. And I think we've got to reflect on that as an industry, and I think the donors also have to reflect on that. There's a lot of wasted money out there in the space at the moment. I don't know if we've got sort of 5 minutes left, if there's any sort of final questions.
Just a few comments. We're from Valgevonden, and we got a small team of guys. And I say there's a huge difference when you got a small team. And I think you can really invest in people. And I think mentorship is one of the biggest things. I don't think you can do that when you got 200 or 300 guys. But I know in a small team, mentorship is you can take somebody who's illiterate and you can take them up to be a trainer or a senior sergeant or whatever. We found that training, and even if they doing a little bit more advanced weapons training or advanced tracking training or whatever, that type of stuff, we find that very motivational. You know, there's not often a large place where they can go. You can't be promoted. You can't all be chiefs or no Indians. And then also when you train the guys very well, we often get the guys in the private sector are poaching the top guys, and they're starting another reserve and they pay 500 Rand more and the guys move around. So, you know, for conservation, it's not a problem, but it does rely that you have to train more people. We do in-house training, but I think, which is very good, I think, but I think we need to evaluate that every now and then. And then the other point that came up, I think, is scenario training. We're very lucky, touch wood, that we don't have a lot of poaching incidents currently, but scenario training keeps the guys on their toes and it keeps them motivated. Yeah, so thanks.
No, Andre, 100%. And that's another question you asked. You know, do you use scenario training in monthly operations? And like, one of the biggest things that you get a no from, no scenario training. Yeah, so we're learning on the job. We're learning during the follow-up, which only happens maybe once a year in some places.
Can I just add a comment on that? Sorry, I'm back at my wedding. I think when I look at the training institution around the sector, there's a bit of a money machine there where you go and you deliver a training activity. During that training activity, there's some top stuff that's being delivered, absolutely. But the minute the trainer lifts off, it falls over, and it goes back to the point about validation, about where's the endurance in all of this effort. And I hear your point exactly on mentorship about if you've got a small team, it's obviously a lot easier to mentor. But I do believe that having that 30-year vision and the understanding of conservation as a 30-plus year problem is where arguably the training sector also now needs to effectively just realign itself. It's not about a 3-week course. It's not about a 2-year training program of 25 training courses. It's about that deep embedding that goes on in between those interventions. There are 2 points. I think the first one's on the mentorship, finding the key people and mentoring them, because ultimately business and the sector is built around people. And then the second thing is building organic capacity. Arguably, a good trainer would be out of a job in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years because they've developed the capacity to take ownership of that forward. And if you look at the very best examples out there, you see organic training capability within the park management system. It's part of the culture. It's the day-to-day routine. And I think, as a external advisor, as a trainer, that's where we arguably should be supporting, is to try to build those organic training capabilities in it. The quotes from Richard Branson, I think, a really apt one here too, about, give people the skills to be able to go, but build a culture so that they don't. And that issue of people being poached and, once you build that capability, often it's not just because of the money, but there is a need to really transform a culture in which some of these superstars are operating and giving them that support. Because if you give them that support, ultimately they're going to feed back in the system at the same time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I have just one question. So I would like to know, after how many years the refresh training can be done?
Every year.
So, yeah, and from our side, I mean, there's 2 types of refresh training, right? There's ones that can be done in-house and, tourniquet application, so you we don't have time, right? Because there's too much going on. There's lots, we're busy. But refresher training can be 5 minutes. It can be you watching me put on a tourniquet and pointing out where I buggered it up, and that's scenario training. And it's about, it doesn't have to always be this complex scenario where we've got dogs and helicopters and, poachers and that's what people think of when they think scenario training is this really complex thing. But it can be really basic scenarios of, show me what your radio procedure's like. There's a rhino down, radio it into, that's refresher training, that's scenario training. But the formalized one is also needed in my mind, and I think that's what you're referring to there.
There's a difference between refresher training and in-house training.
Yeah.
And I think that terminology there is suitable. Once a week you can do some in-house training. But, if you can do a 21-day refresher course every year, that'll be a good start. And then in-house training monthly, even weekly. 1 day a week, you just do 2 hours. That's what you can do. Thanks.
Is there time for one more?
Yes, sure.
The lack of representation during the trainings from the training providers. So them seeing a lady doing the trainings, someone who has the same skin color as them, is also something that plays into the motivation of them doing the work. So I guess what my question is, and comments from everyone who's working with rangers across the continent, how are we all being conscious of the lack of diversity in terms of ethnicity, and also respecting and incorporating indigenous knowledge during these training programs and coming up with the best practices?
Yeah, I mean, what a cracking question that one was. Thank you very much. Look, I think one of the things I sort of want to link back to is, I think, is it Andre on the front here? You brought up a point at the beginning. Isn't it really important to consult the rangers? What do you want to train up on? What do you think you need to be? Getting them to think about what it is that they've got to do better. I'm not happy with these skills. It's great to have that feedback loop where you can incorporate that. And I think you rightly brought up a point as well about this, working with communities and all. I think it's incredibly important, because sometimes when we talk about training, we can just concentrate on that sort of stuff that we, really like. But actually, probably the most important thing we've got to do is recognise that we're working within an ecosystem, and that there are communities out there that we have to work with. Everything we're involved with, it's affected by human endeavour. And this is this point, I think, that Andrew's brought up at the beginning, is this idea of holistic training. Holistic training means everything from making sure that all of the rangers know that they're representative of the park, the region, and the people. I don't believe there is a divide between rangers and communities. I don't believe that exists. Rangers live in the communities, their children go to the schools there, they're part of the community. But making sure that they know how to interact, making sure that incredibly important. I'm really, really glad you brought that up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. I think the next session is document. There are my details. Feel free to reach out. And then just lastly, the State of the Ranger report. James, put your hand up. So IRF, which is the International Ranger Federation, and URSA are busy compiling the State of the Ranger report for what is the global state of rangers. And things like this, tie into that as the state of training and the state of things. There's 2 questionnaires. One is for ranger employers and the other is for rangers themselves. And I think it's really important that we get representation from both sides of that, because sometimes what the employers say the rangers need, or the situation is slightly different to what the rangers are saying themselves. So you can email me as well for that if you would like to. It's easy enough to send on, or you can email info@Game Ranger, and Louise will get back to you. But it's a very basic report questionnaire. It takes for 15 minutes or so. It can be shared with WhatsApp, but it's really looking at the state of the rangers across the world as we go, work towards the World Ranger Congress next year, October. So thanks for listening. Hopefully, as I say, hopefully there's some more comments and questions and input on this, and we look forward to taking it further. Cheers. And thanks to my esteemed panel. Not the prettiest bunch, but